the presentation. Going to talk through some background, get some information on vape devices, what are they actually really made out of, their different components, some of the actual usage estimates, talk through some of the actual risks associated with vapes in the waste stream, both from the nicotine and from the lithium-ion batteries, and just some information when it comes to disposal under RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So as a background for vapes, ultimately vapes are used to aerosolize things. It's not really meant to vaporize things. There's a little misconception there. Vapes really aerosolize, they don't vaporize. But they can be used to aerosolize all sorts of different kinds of substances, so long as that substance can maintain its active ingredient at the temperature the carrying fluid is being aerosolized at. And that includes nicotine. That can include these cannabinoids. You can even actually vape certain psychedelics as well. Some people vape different aromatics. So there are a number of different things that these devices can be used for, but ultimately they all have some core consistent internals to them. And that is a mouthpiece, which this little image here shows is also sometimes referred to as a drip tip. You have some kind of assembly that holds the liquid that's going to be vaped, as well as the what's called the atomizer assembly, which is really what's going to be heating the substance up to cause the aerosolization. And then, of course, you have a power source, in which case pretty much every single vape device uses a lithium-ion battery. And there are a couple of different types of vapes. Chief amongst those are single-use vapes, also referred to as SUVs, or as disposables. And you have the reusable cartridge-based vapes, and then reusable tank-based vapes. So the single-use vapes, those are ones that people are really concerned about because you're seeing them littering sidewalks, parking lots. They're just, being used once and thrown away. The reusable cartridge-based vapes, these are things like your Juuls, where you have the power source that can be recharged typically, and you're just replacing the actual tank and atomizer assembly when you need to, when you run out of whatever vape juice you're using. And then the reusable tank-based vapes are referred to as mods. And these mods are ones that you typically have a battery that can be pulled out and replaced as necessary, as well as a fully disassemble the atomizer assembly. So the images, that topmost one, that is what would be referred to as a mod. The image to the far right, that would be one of the cartridge-based systems where you can take the little juice cartridge, which is that black bit. You can take that off and replace it. And then the bottom image is a single-use vape, where you just use it that one time and throw it away. This is a couple images of different single-use vapes that are pulled apart, where you can see the batteries, and the battery is that silver cylindrical object with kind of a red cap and black cap on it. Now, the actual vape usage, based on these different categories, has been fluctuating over time. And is just a really fantastic little graph that shows that fluctuation. And note, though, is that these estimates are based off of convenience stores and multi-outlets, not necessarily directly from vape shops. But you'll notice right here, back in 2020, like January of 2020, there's a pretty big shift where you go from the disposable devices, or actually you go from the pre-filled cartridge devices, and you start to see more consumers choosing disposable devices. And that's actually partly due to something the USDA had done, or the FDA had done, where they started to preferentially enforce a policy that was to remove access to flavored vape juices. And so that policy, they specifically implemented and enforced that against flavored vape juices from pre-filled cartridges. They didn't actually really enforce that against disposable devices. So you had a pretty sizable population of vape users who enjoyed these flavored vape juices that said, hey, we can't get these from the pre-filled cartridges anymore. We're going to go ahead and start using disposables. And that is ultimately what really drove a lot of this change in consumer behavior. And that's also kind of reflected here, where different manufacturers or suppliers of vape devices started to really start to capitalize on that change in consumer behavior. And so this just shows the average volume of vape juice that a device can hold. This one is the actual nicotine strength itself. And then right there is the cost associated with the vape liquid, and so right around that change, you had these single-use vape manufacturers and suppliers that said, okay, we're going to start providing consumers with more vape juice at a higher concentration at a cheaper price, and it stuck. And so by and large, the majority of vape uses in use today are those single-use vape devices. So here's just essentially a table version of that graph that was shown earlier. And you can see the 550% change in the single-use vape units that are sold between 2019 to 2023. Pretty sizable. And percent sale went from 13% to 58%. Those cartridge-based systems cut in half. And then those e-liquids, that's pretty much for those mods that I'd mentioned, where you're not actually removing a cartridge and replacing it with a cartridge. You just have that atomizer tank assembly that you're refilling with a liquid. You're vaping it and just refilling with a liquid. But it's not as common as you can see based off of these numbers here. So then so that's based off of the sales volume, but then estimates on the actual vape users. So recurring vape users here in the US for adults, it's about 6.5% of the total population, which is up from the 2021 estimate of 4.5% of population. When you look at at students in school, there are more high school students that are vaping, 7.8% of the population. Middle school students aren't quite as much as 3.5% of the middle school population. But ultimately, though, it does seem that there are more young people vaping today than there was about 5 years ago. However, when you compare it today to last year, it does seem that the actual vape usage has been decreasing just a little bit, and it's kind of a question on whether or not that's actually going to be a consistent trend. But anyways, so yeah, there have been quite a few students that are started vape as compared to in the past, but ultimately, across all age groups, quite a few people have reported actually wanting to quit vaping or have tried to quit, and that's about 2/3. That's for adults, middle school students, and high school students. So something too here is on the nicotine usage. There's this misconception, I guess, that if you're vaping with nicotine, and that's not always true. And there was a study from 2015 that asked a lot of the middle school and high school students who vaped consistently about what they actually vaped with. And those students responded that the majority of them had simply just been vaping flavorings as opposed to anything with an active ingredient in it like nicotine or marijuana. Now, of course, that is just one study, and it was also just looking at the type of vape juice that was used last, as opposed to over their entire vaping history. But it still is something to suggest that perhaps the nicotine usage, the prevalence of nicotine in vape devices, at least in schools, might not be as high as folks might think potentially. Now, when it comes to the actual disposal of these vape devices, there was a study that looked at about 1,300 young vape users and asked them essentially how are they actually dealing with their single-use vapes, and the majority said that they are in fact throwing it away in the trash. However, I have this highlighted that about a fifth of those who responded stated that they're keeping vape devices, and there's this idea that perhaps young vapors are actually starting to keep their vape devices instead of throwing them away because they know that lithium-ion batteries are bad. You can't easily just throw them away. And they also, they're not easily recycled either. And it's kind of this catch 22 stuck between a rock and a hard place where they don't want to cause problems by throwing them away, but they also just don't know what to do with them. And so folks are starting to actually keep the vape devices. I was speaking with a couple people at a vape shop recently, asking them about what they're doing, and they mentioned the exact same thing, that they're keeping their vape devices because they don't know how to handle them. So I think that really underpins the need to provide some education to vape users on actually how to handle these things, which EPA is doing a good job of. So from there, the implications, vape usage, it has been rising. However, it seems recently it's maybe be decreasing. We'll see if that actually is a consistent trend. Most vapes are those single-use vapes, and most of those are being disposed of in municipal landfills. So estimate about 8 million of these SUVs per month across the country. And of course, when disposed of, the vapes likely still contain some sort of vape juice, which may contain nicotine, as well as the power source, those lithium-ion batteries. So, what's the problem? Well, those two materials, they are of some concern. So the nicotine-containing vape juices, as we all know, it can be toxic. It was used as a pesticide back in the day, as well as it being a presumed P075 acutely hazardous waste under RCRA. Now, the lithium-ion batteries, that's another topic where they are, starting to cause fires in the waste system. And they're also presumed to be a D001 and D003 characteristic hazardous waste, which would be an ignitable hazardous waste and a reactive hazardous waste. At least that's what EPA presumes they are. So that first point, though, nicotine toxicity. So nicotine can, in fact, be fatal. As I mentioned, it was used as a pesticide. Folks have tried using it to well, that's a sensitive topic. I'm not necessarily sure if I can state that for YouTube, if it is going to the National SB's YouTube, but it has been used for certain purposes to end people's lives. And so there is this concept of lethal dosage is 60 milligrams. But there's kind of this history to where that 60 milligrams comes from. And there's this fascinating article on the history of it, and ultimately found that the originator for the 60 milligrams was based off of some highly dubious self-experiments that were performed in the mid of the 19th century that also ignored some conflicting data. And so in that same article, the authors provide evidence for a different dosage that would actually be the lower end of the lethal dose, which would be about 6.5 to 13 milligrams per kilogram, much higher. Now, if you do, of course, have some nicotine toxicity, there are going to be a few symptoms. You can experience some burning, salivation, vomiting, rapid heart rate, unsteadiness, not good things to experience. And when it comes to vape juices, well, there are three different kinds of vape juices that you can get that contain nicotine. You've got free base vape juices. You have a tobacco-free nicotine, and then you have a salt-based version of nicotine. And so listed there are some of the typical concentrations that you might find. And you'll notice that lethal dose of 60 milligrams, well, that is very close to the 50 milligram per milliliter content that you might find on some of the stronger vape juices. So I did a little bit of a deeper dive to try and find, what actually, if there are actual reported cases of poisonings from nicotine from vapes. And so I did find three different articles they looked through. One was a meta-analysis that looked across different countries. One was specifically on occupational exposures, and one was from the CDC. And so ultimately, the meta-analysis showed that adults can, in fact, survive dosages exceeding that 60 milligrams, and that the overwhelming number of adult poisonings are intentional, which you can see in this figure to the right. The CDC report showed that the vast majority of those who experienced poisonings were young. 93% were from the age of 0 to 17. Only 7% of poisonings were for those who were 18 or older. Additionally, if we're concerned, about nicotine poisonings from vapes waste specifically, well, vape waste, you're probably not going to actually be aerosolizing the nicotine at that point, but you might be able to get it on your skin or maybe in a mucous membrane. And so the exposure route reported in those CDC cases, only 3.5% of them were reported to have been through a dermal exposure. 40% of them were from ingestion, and then 61% of them were from being inhalation. And then the occupational exposure case report, this is actually kind of a very interesting thing, where this was a case of a person in France who was actually working at a vape liquid manufacturing facility. And as they were working, they accidentally spilled pure nicotine on their leg. And they were not wearing pants, they were wearing shorts. And so he expelled 300,000 milligrams of nicotine on the leg. And ultimately, it was reported that within a minute of that spill, he had experienced dizziness, nausea, headaches, burning sensations, all those typical symptoms. But ultimately, he went to the hospital and he survived. So the takeaways there from these three different reviews is that the actual unintentional and acute poisonings, specifically from vape-related materials, is pretty unlikely, but it might still happen. And so as a result, if you are working with vape waste, it is ultimately very important that you still wear PPE and you practice safe handling procedures. So from there, we've got these lithium-ion batteries as well. And as EPA's report on lithium-ion battery fires shows, we are seeing more and more fires in the waste system. And a lot of those, majority, as shown in this, the figure to the right, 40% of them are estimated to be from lithium-ion batteries, 15% from unknown battery, 10% from some other kind of rechargeable battery. Batteries are causing a lot of fires in the waste system. And so here's a figure from a fantastic research article on the mechanisms underlying the reason that these batteries can actually catch fire. It's a little bit busy, so here are really the main points. The main point is that batteries that are abused, whether it's from some mechanical instance, electrical instance, or thermal instance, can short circuit internally. And when they short circuit internally, they can release all of their pent-up energy in a very short time span, which can ultimately cause them to heat up. And a result of that heating up, it can cause the actual flame or the actual explosion that is causing a lot of the problems. So abuse leads to short circuit, leads to problems. And unfortunately, the waste system, it is inherently incompatible with handling these lithium-ion batteries because they are rife with these different triggers to cause mechanical abuse, right? Whether it goes into a trash truck, a garbage truck, or into a landfill or where have you, where it gets crushed, mechanical abuse. The electrical abuse could be simply from being immersed in liquid in a trash can or in a garbage can where it might rain, get some liquid on it, or even in the landfill itself, if liquid is percolating through, can cause a short circuit to occur from the liquid, causing that bridge in the connection. And of course, you have the thermal abuse, where in landfills they can heat up from just some exothermic reactions that are occurring there, or by just sitting out in the sun potentially. So all of these different triggers are present in the waste system. Ultimately, though, some batteries might not cause as much of a problem as other batteries, right? And that is mediated by its capacity, as well as something called the state of charge. The state of charge is actually really important. So ultimately, right, if you have a battery that short circuits with a crazy amount of energy, its potential to heat up is much greater than a battery that discharges with a little bit of energy. And so that's just where these two components, the capacity with the state of charge, comes into play. If you have a high capacity battery that's fully charged, you have more energy that can be dumped, causing everything to heat up, causing things to ignite. Versus a low capacity battery that's pretty much drained. There's nothing to it. It's essentially dead. So here's a really, I guess, illuminating figure that comes from, I believe, the FAA when they actually did some testing on failure mechanisms on a plane that caught fire. And right here, they used the same types of batteries, and they induced that short circuiting so they could figure out what actually was going on. And you can see on the 30% state of charge, the batteries, they swelled, but nothing else happened. They just got swollen. The 70% state of charge, they definitely they got a little toasty, and they definitely emitted gas. They broke. On the 100% state of charge, fire. So the risks associated with actual vape batteries themselves, there are two studies I had found. One is looking at a 100% state of charge, 550 milliamp hour cell from a single-use vape, and found that there was a fire risk associated with pretty much everywhere on the device when this thing actually short-circuited. Then there's another study I found that was also looking at a 550 milliamp cell battery, and they looked into a 50% state of charge. And ultimately, what they found is that if the battery was less than that 50% state of charge, it ultimately could not get to a hot enough temperature to cause any ignition of surrounding waste materials.
Find that hard to believe.
Oh, well, that is, yeah. So that kind of gets into the whole thing of how much actual energy there is, as well as the surrounding material. Because older waste material, from my understanding, is, I believe, I might have this flip-flopped, is actually easier to ignite than new waste material, simply due to the water content that it can contain. So actually, yeah, right. So how many fires do vapes actually cause? So there is this, trying to find data can be a little bit difficult. But there is this data source that I'd found that was pretty early on. You can see it's from 2009 to 2016, roughly. And there's an interesting thing here at play. And I don't believe that this is necessarily data that can be used currently, but it still kind of illustrates that fires can be caused by these e-cigarettes. And it mentioned specifically that 66% of incidents that involved an e-cigarette did cause ignition of nearby material. But there's a thing that was occurring in the vape industry, I guess, at this point in time, and that was that vape users were making mods. At this point, all you had was essentially those pen vapes, or essentially cigarette-like vapes, but people wanted things bigger. They wanted to be able to create a lot of smoke, a lot of clouds, you know. They wanted to have a higher temperature. And so they started to modify their own vapes. This is actually where that term mod comes from. And so there are instances of people making vapes out of Altoid cans, taking their own batteries, doing their own wirings, and there were a lot of problems because of that. And recently, not even recently, but shortly after a lot of these problems came to light, the vape industry, they started actually producing essentially ready to go mods. So you could have that higher temperature, you could have those clouds that you wanted to, without also incurring the risk of explosions, or electrocutions, or anything associated with making and doing your own electrical work on something you're putting close to your face. So current examples, though, well, EPA did this 2021 analysis of lithium-ion battery fires, waste management and recycling, and it looked through to find specifically examples that had to do with waste, or with vapes specifically. And there were only 3 that I could find. And one of them, this image here, log 29, is of a vape device that looks like it would be one of those mods. And I say that because they have these green batteries that you can see kind of littered around that space, and it looks like a fairly large device, and likely from one of those vape mods, which have high battery capacities. And this may very well have been a situation where the state of charge was fairly high. So then the second example had to do with at a university. And in this case, the vape was already sparking when it was thrown into the trash can. It was not necessarily thrown into the trash can as a vape, just because somebody was done vaping. It was thrown away because it was already identified as a fire hazard and a problem, which caused a fire. And then the third and final example in this analysis the EPA had done was a situation where a vape device had been thrown away and was ultimately pressed up against a larger lithium-ion battery, and was also pressed in the on position. And as a result of being pressed on the on position, the vape, it gets hot, it gets heated. likely had ignited that larger battery next to it due to that whole thermal abuse issue, failure mechanism that I had shown earlier. So ultimately, looking at those cases, the danger comes from a lot of those user modified systems, as well as some of the safety features. Backing up just a little bit on this one here, a lot of there are safety features being built into current vape devices now, and that's where instead of having a button to actually activate the vape, you actually just have a draw activation where you actually have to inhale through the vape, which then turns it on, as opposed to having a physical button that you press to turn it on. And that is a way that the vape industry has tried to remedy some of the concerns on causing fires. So anyways, for a given state of charge, the pod and mod batteries are going to be a greater threat than a SUV battery simply due to its capacity. Those pod and mod devices use the batteries that are intended to be charged, intended to be reused, as opposed to those SUVs. Additionally, those lightly used SUVs pose a greater risk than heavily used SUVs, simply because that state of charge for lightly used SUVs are going to be higher. Higher state of charge, higher energy potential, higher risk of causing a fire. And that actually has a further implication that I want to address here, and that's that different waste streams can have different characteristics. If you have a school that is taking these vape devices and confiscating it, well, those vape devices probably haven't been used nearly as much as a vape device that's being used at home, where somebody can use it until it's dead. And so the vape devices from schools that aren't being used until they're dead are going to have a higher state of charge, a higher fire risk than those vapes that are being used at home, where they can be used until they're dead. So that's an implication that might actually be of interest. And then the other point is that ultimately there isn't a consistent or consolidated mechanism to report vape-specific fires or lithium-ion battery-specific fires. And so some of the data is scarce, and it could very well be that this figure is still trending upwards at the rate it has. I don't believe it actually is, or else I think it would have much more of a media presence like it did back in those days. But ultimately, more data is still needed. More data is always needed. So what can you do to be safe? Well, when it comes to mitigating those emergencies, EPA had asked a lot of the different waste haulers, disposal sites, what are they doing? What are they trying to do to be safe? And the big responses was that they would try to isolate the batteries and that they would do trainings and education campaigns. Ultimately, that's for the waste haulers, but in general, though, it's recommended that you don't intentionally disassemble vape devices or these batteries if they are not designed to be disassembled. It's just like in a phone, you try not to disassemble to get to a battery unless you actually know what you're doing and you can readily disassemble it, because the risk of accidentally puncturing the battery are pretty high. Don't intentionally disassemble things unless it's meant to be disassembled. Other point is to try to keep them away from sources of heat so they don't have that thermal abuse. And of course, be prepared, go through emergency trainings, procedures, and have some kits readily available. And if you do end up having a fire, use PPE. The smoke that comes off of these lithium-ion batteries can contain some pretty nasty, gnarly chemicals. Be safe. Also, try to isolate batteries from anything that's nearby to make sure that you don't have a fire that spreads. From my understanding, that's the way that firefighters are being taught how to handle electric car battery fires. Isolate. And then the other thing is actually kind of interesting here is on actually how to extinguish or trying to douse or to cool off a battery that might be about to enter into that kind of thermal runaway cycle, just heating, and then catching a fire, is that you can use water. You actually can. Even the NFPA states that you can use water. Now, that is specific to these lithium-ion batteries, though. It's not, it's not applicable to lithium metal batteries. And the difference between those is just that the lithium metal batteries, those ones are single use. They're not rechargeable. The lithium ion batteries are the rechargeable batteries. Looking towards the future too, there is some proposed legislation, HR 9588, the Thermal Runaway Reduction Act, that would try to establish a requirement that batteries that are offered for transport have a specific state of charge at maximum of 30%. And that is to ultimately make sure that if an incident occurs, if the battery gets crushed, if the battery experiences thermal issues, if it experiences electrical issues, that it's not going to discharge as so much energy that it's going to cause an actual emergency situation. And that would also include the transportation of waste batteries. And if you want, I can talk a little bit about how to actually try to get to a state of charge like that. But something of interest I only recently realized that it does not address something called a rebound effect, which is where if you try to discharge a battery, it'll discharge, but then it kind of rebounds up just a little bit. And so you can say we're going to discharge it down to the 30% state of charge, but then offer for transport, and then while it's on transport, might rebound upwards and then enter into that dangerous category again. So talked through some of the nicotine toxicity, some of the battery fires. Now we're talking a little bit about that RCRA waste management. So ultimately, EPA does have some fantastic guidance when it comes to managing vape waste for just individuals at home as well as for businesses and schools. I don't have, if you look at this presentation afterwards and you click on those links, it'll take you to it. Or if you just look up EPA vape waste management household or school, you'll find the links. But ultimately, there's a big push from EPA as well as here in Kansas, not sure about other states, that residents take their vape waste to a household hazardous waste facility. It is something that cannot be managed as just it's recommended, try not to throw it away in the trash. Don't throw it into recycling or into e-recycling. If you have vape waste from a business or a school, ultimately they are responsible under RCRA to conduct waste determinations to know if the waste they're generating is actually hazardous or not. Maybe their lithium-ion batteries are not reactive, are not ignitable. Maybe the nicotine is not a P075 waste, depending on what's actually being done with it. So from there, state whether or not it is a hazardous waste or not, and then you would be tabulating the total amount of your hazardous waste per calendar month, and is being accumulated to determine a generator category. And so under RCRA, there are different generator categories, and each generator category outlines the generator's requirements. The more you generate, the more you accumulate, the greater the category, the greater the requirements. Here in Kansas, our requirements are our generators are split into 4 categories. We have a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, Kansas small quantity generator, small quantity generator, large quantity generator. At the federal level, it's split between a very small quantity generator, small quantity generator, and a large quantity generator. Very small quantity generator is the same as a Kansas small quantity generator, essentially at the 220-pound threshold. So ultimately, that first point, though, conduct waste determinations. Nicotine vape juice, typically an acutely hazardous waste under the P075 waste code. Lithium-ion batteries, typically a characteristic hazardous waste as D001 ignitable and D003 reactive. From there, as mentioned, you'd start tabulating how much you're actually accumulating, how much you're generating, and determining your waste generator category based off of that. And so EPA's guidance is that to hit the 2.2-pound threshold to be considered a large quantity generator, actually backing up just a little bit, nicotine, there's a point to be made here that it's acutely hazardous. Lithium-ion batteries, they're not considered acutely hazardous. And this is important because acutely hazardous waste and non-acutely hazardous waste have different thresholds for determining a generator category. And that's kind of shown in this table down there at the bottom, where acutely hazardous waste, if you generate 2.2 pounds of it in a calendar month, you're a large quantity generator. It is what it is, no matter what. If you're generating non-acutely hazardous waste, you really do have those thresholds that are easier to I guess establish or to control, I guess you could say. So because nicotine is acutely hazardous, it's really important to try to make sure you're not exceeding that 2.2 pound threshold. And so EPA's estimate on that 2.2 pound threshold is that you would have to generate either 1,000 Juul pods, 76 ELF bars being a single-use vape device, or 200 full 5 milliliter vials. And if you're to hit the 220 pound threshold for non-acute hazardous waste, which would be the very small quantity generator, which is the smallest generator category at the federal level, would require 2,000 of an 18650 type of lithium-ion battery. Now, the single-use vape devices, they do generally use a smaller sized battery, but the 18650 is a pretty common generic lithium-ion battery cell. So once you do make your determination on what generator category you are, you would follow the actual management requirements for that category. So some considerations here, though, is that we got a couple things. The mixture rule is that if you have a hazardous waste that mixes with another waste, then that other waste, the entire waste stream, could be hazardous waste as well. In this case, when you have nicotine, that is an acutely hazardous waste due to its toxicity, then if it mixes with the waste, the entire thing is going to be acutely hazardous toxic waste. It needs to be managed as such. It's going to cost you a lot of money, and it's going to be all that much easier to hit that threshold to be a large quantity generator. So you don't want to be mixing nicotine vape juices with other waste materials. Something that can be done to reduce your generator amount would be to try and manage the batteries, lithium-ion batteries, as universal waste, because that does not count as towards the generator limits. Note here that the battery, if you do try and recycle a lithium-ion battery through as universal waste, that it does need to be removed from the device. If it's not removed, then it cannot be managed as universal waste. And another point here is on the actual recycling. And there's an EPA memo 14851 that states that if a vape device is in fact legitimately recycled, then it is not considered solid waste. And as a result, it cannot be considered hazardous waste either. However, the difficulty is that there's pretty much no recycling companies out there that I'm aware of that do recycle vape devices. It's just not something that a lot of businesses find feasible. Though there is a single company, if you look at that EPA memo 14851, it does have one company listed. It's actually the company that asked about it that caused the memo to be created in the first place, called Nightshade, but their website is very, very silent. So I'm not too sure if they're really still being, if they're still operating or not. But anyways, the final point here to consider is that there is a final rule that EPA made on amending the P075 listing for nicotine that would exempt nicotine that's used in FDA-approved over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies. That nicotine would not have a P075 listing. That amendment does not apply to vape waste, though. Be aware of that. So something I wanted to do here, because we've got the project to work with schools on vape devices and handling and disposal, is trying to see how much of an actual issue is there. And so I did a lot of assumptions, made a lot of assumptions, and essentially looked at the population, the percentage of population that actually vapes, as well as the different types of vape devices that are being used, and then looked at the different populations of the schools and their usage, as well as the estimate on vape juice that actually contains nicotine that students would be using, as well as disposal routes, and found that with a lot of these assumptions, that there are no schools in Kansas that meet the a 55-pound limit for lithium-ion batteries concurrently on site. And the 55-pound limit is for Kansas's smallest category of hazardous waste generator. And for the 2.2 pound for nicotine, I found that there were 26 schools in Kansas out of 532 that would meet that 2.2 pound threshold, assuming that every single vape actually used nicotine. If only half the student population was using nicotine, then there would be 0 schools that actually would have 2.2 pounds of the vape juice on site concurrently. So that's kind of just a little look into some of the data and just making kind of a just trying to see if there's really a big issue for schools here in Kansas or not. But ultimately, we did put out this little guidance document that I think is pretty helpful. Um, then one last quick point is on the risk of non-compliance. Ultimately, we want to make sure that folks are complying with environmental regulations. Um, because ultimately it's safe. It's safe for the environment, it's safe for people, and if you're non-compliant, then there are some risks associated with that. 2023, Oregon Vape Shop was found to be non-compliant with how they're managing their vape waste and was fined 32,000 some dollars. Pretty big hit. So ultimately, to try to be compliant, it is imperative that you know your waste streams. You know if you generate these lithium-ion batteries, you know if you generate these nicotine vape juices, and you know if they're actually hazardous waste or not. And you know your generator category because you know your waste streams. And then you know your generator category's requirements because you know your generator category because you know your waste streams. So those three pillars of RCRA compliance, very important. Ultimately, in summary, uh, vape usage has risen substantially, especially for SUVs. There seems like there might be kind of a downward decline just in the past year or two. See if that's actually going to be holding over the long term. But ultimately, over the past 10 years, vape usage really high, which is putting people in more contact, or the potential to put them in contact with more nicotine and these batteries. We know that nicotine is in fact toxic, but it is not nearly as toxic as is commonly cited. Ultimately, though, be safe and wear PPE if you expect to be in contact with nicotine. Batteries, they are causing fires, and they're a higher risk of causing a serious incident if they have a high charge and a high capacity. Batteries that are at a 50% state of charge may not pose a big fire risk. The proposed legislation caps the state of charge at 30%. But ultimately, the greater the capacity, the greater the state of charge, the greater the risk of incident. And if if you are handling these wastes, isolate them, isolate the batteries so there's less of a chance of causing a fire from surrounding material. Wear PPE if fire does occur, and maybe the point of using water might don't actually do that in case you might have mixed battery streams, in case you have multiple different kinds of material that's coming through your facilities, or especially at like a landfill where you don't know if it's actually a lithium ion or a lithium metal. So point on that, use water only if you know it's actually a lithium ion battery. Um, Ultimately, waste may be RCRA hazardous if they're from a residence, managed as a household hazardous waste, assuming that's something that your state can actually approves of. And otherwise, RCRA hazardous waste, if it's battery, universal waste. If it's nicotine, make sure you keep it separate from other materials. Yes, that is my presentation. Any questions? Cool. Okay. And I do see that I have about 10 minutes or so left. So in case Colorado, in case you would like to talk a little bit about the lithium ion batteries and the guidance document, feel free to. Otherwise, I am here for questions if you'd like. I believe I put the my email address on there. But yeah,
Jacob,
let me know
there's
if you
one
do.
at the chat.
Okay, let's see here.
It's more of a-
Right. Any best management practices for schools to collect vape waste since their students are not supposed to be having them and materials at schools and they're causing problems. So I guess yeah. So best management practices. Actually, I'm gonna share EPA's website on this because it actually contains those best management practices. And it also discusses a number of the different disposal possibilities for schools depending on their size. Um, let's see here. That is for individuals. Okay, there we go. So Yeah, wearing PPE, always important. Trying to isolate anything that's leaking. So if you have a vape device that you can tell it has a leaking tank on it, then you want to put that into a plastic baggie. That's going to help make sure that any surrounding material does not get contaminated with that acutely listed hazardous waste, which would prevent that other material from also becoming acutely hazardous waste. Um, so isolating anything that's leaking, having batteries that are bulging or have any signs of damage, put those on sand in like a metal container. Having emergency response material nearby. I know EPA has a few things also on making sure that whatever the school's waste disposal provider is, to make sure that they're coming through on a regular basis to make sure that the school never accumulates more than the 2.2 pounds of acutely hazardous waste at any one time. So the question on battery charge. Oh, where's my mouse? There it is. Hello. Okay, how would people test the battery charge in SUVs to confirm they're meeting the SOC limit of 30%? Yeah. Okay, so that gets into some interesting things. So I think when it comes to that proposed legislation to that would make sure that any batteries that are being sent for transport have that 30% state of charge, that's going to be applying to your businesses. That's going to be applying to your schools, to your offices. And so yeah, I don't believe it actually the le proposed legislation establishes who would really be responsible for that. Because I believe that's something that it is that the proposed legislation is essentially saying, hey, do this, and it's giving authority to the regulating agency to then establish how to really do that. But there are two primary routes to reduce a battery state of charge intentionally, for the purposes of reducing its risk of causing incident. Um, and one of those is through an external circuit discharging, of which there's a salt bath. You can essentially have a big old bath of a salt. You put your batteries in it, and that's going to essentially discharge it, but it also causes corrosion on the batteries, which can also release the electrolyte into the bath water, which causes its own issues for waste handling, as well as vapors that can be emitted during the actual electrochemical process, which can emit some actual toxic vapors depending on the salt that's being used. So it's kind of an iffy thing using a salt bath. There's a powdered bed, and what is it? Conductive powder bed discharging, which essentially you have a bed of carbon flakes that you stick your batteries into, that you don't have that same corrosion issue or vapor emission problem. But it's not, from my understanding, as economically or it doesn't have the same chance of scaling up properly, I guess you could say, as the salt bed does. And then, yeah, the other issue too is that the actual rate of discharge is pretty slow compared to the salt bath. That was a primary problem. Slow rate of discharge. So if you're trying to handle a crazy number of batteries at a time, you have to wait for a long period of time to actually go through it. Everybody, wants things quick, done fast. So it was one of the issues with that. And then the other option for the external circuit discharge is by using a load circuit, which is essentially you take a battery, you put some terminals to it, and you put a load on that terminal, just some sort of resistive element to force it to actually discharge. But that is not very scalable or feasible for large quantities of batteries. The method that's being done currently, so if you talk about recycling batteries and you're like, man, if we're trying to recycle these batteries and we're not controlling the state of charge when it enters the recycling facility, doesn't that put the recycling facility at risk? Yes. There are two different methods that some recycling facilities do, though, and that is passivation. And there's chemical passivation and thermal passivation. In chemical passivation, you're trying to take these batteries and cause a chemical reaction to essentially create a layer that would be developed. And this is something I'm not too as familiar with, to prevent the batteries from having an issue with a short circuit. Thermal passivation, you're really just degrading the thing with heat. Some facilities, though, they don't go through that process and they simply feed the batteries very slowly into a crushing machine, and they control the actual rate of the batteries being sent into the process as a way to control the overall temperature of the process. Um, but yeah, no, it's an interesting concept of state of charge and trying to control that. I can try and find a link. I can try and send you a link if you're interested. But yeah, for a person or for a business to determine the state of charge at the point of disposal, that would require them to actually access the battery itself. And so if you're using battery embedded devices where you can't easily disassemble to access the battery, there's not really an easy way to actually figure that out. Um, but otherwise, some batteries, there is a voltage to state of charge chart that you can consult, and you would just simply monitor and read the voltage across the battery's terminals, look at the chart, and you can establish what the state of charge is from there. Hope I didn't ramble on too crazy there, but
Jacob,
yeah.
Donovan has a question.
Hey,
Yes.
Jacob. Um, so while this is mostly looking at small scale, uh, is there any provisions, especially for vape shops, for essentially the pharmaceutical take back under the pharmaceutical rule revisions for solid waste a while back?
Yeah.
Did that actually ever go through?
So that depends on the state. Here in Kansas, we have not adopted and we're not authorized to implement that amendment. Um, and so as a result, I don't know nearly as much about it as some others might. But yes, there was a rule, a final rule that did get passed that establishes or changed the way that pharmaceuticals, hazardous waste pharmaceuticals were being managed. And that's also actually the same rule that established the P075 listing exemption for the FDA approved over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies. Um, so there, I can try and find a document that actually goes over a lot of the internals of that final rule. But essentially, the big point of it is that you cannot dispose of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals into the sewer drain. Can't do that. That's a big no-no. That's actually something that's blanket applied to every state, even states that have not formally adopted or are authorized to implement the amendment. Um, but there was a change to the way the take back program is working. And the take back, and the reason is that EPA had found that pharmaceuticals that are being taken back are not really being recycled. And as a result, it's ultimately that it is still considered a waste and is still needs to be counted as a waste. That's my understanding at a thousand yard height. Like I said, though, we in Kansas haven't implemented that, so I might have some of those details wrong. If anybody else does, can chime in on that.
Excellent. Thank you, Jacob.
Yeah. Any states looking at adding vape waste onto e-waste programs? Producer responsibility. Ooh, that's a good question. I don't honestly know. Um, so there was a webinar from the from NERC, I think the Northeast Recycling Council, that discussed the recycling of battery embedded devices, which can include vape devices. And I have a link to that webinar, actually. I actually have it up right now, that I can share. And you might be able to find an answer to that is more universal to just battery embedded devices as opposed to vape specifically. There might be something in there. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know right off the top of my head. Alrighty. I see that it is now 2 o'clock. Yeah, feel free to contact me with any questions. Hope it was an informative presentation. I'm glad you all could join.
Yes, I think it was a very informative and well done presentation. Thank you very much, Jacob. I could have listened for another 15 to 30 minutes. I did find it very interesting.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And Christine Grossman, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing your last